Greg's opposition to my wind turbine wasn't about noise or regulations. It was personal. As HOA president, he had financial interests in large-scale wind farms and sought to eliminate any challenge to that, even on a small scale. His agenda wasn't about community welfare, but control. Despite my turbine meeting all legal standards, Greg used his position to influence the HOA's decisions, disregarding facts and framing the issue as one of community harmony. This wasn't just a fight over noise. It was about exposing the power dynamics within the HOA, where personal gains took precedence over collective interests. Greg's animosity toward me began before the wind turbine ever became an issue. I had moved into the neighborhood a decade ago after inheriting my uncle's home. My uncle had spent years building this house, and it stood as a testament to his skill and perseverance. I was proud to carry on his legacy. However, from the moment I arrived, Greg, as president of the HOA, made it clear that I was an outsider. His initial criticisms were subtle but consistent, starting with the color of the house. Offbeat was the term he used, suggesting that it didn't fit the neighborhood's traditional aesthetic. This kind of remark seemed trivial at first, but it soon became clear that Greg's disapproval ran deeper. I was not the kind of person who cared for the golf course gatherings or the rigid, uniform standards the HOA imposed. My uncle had designed the house to reflect individuality, and I saw no reason to change that. To Greg, my disregard for the community's unwritten rules made me a target. I wasn't interested in conforming, and that became the basis for his growing opposition. At first, the issues seemed minor complaints about small details, like the color of my house or the positioning of my mailbox. Each time, Greg would approach me with what he called concerns about how my property didn't align with the standards expected by the HOA. These issues were often vague, based more on his personal preferences than any clear guideline. I began to realize that Greg wasn't just enforcing the rules, he was selectively interpreting them, often to suit his own agenda. My decision to install the wind turbine, however, marked a significant shift. This was no longer about minor aesthetic concerns. It was about something that threatened the status quo. The turbine was a visible symbol of independence, a choice to provide my own energy rather than depend on the grid. It was a statement about sustainability and self-sufficiency. But it was also a challenge to the community's norms, and Greg saw that challenge as something to be eliminated. From the outset, Greg used the HOA as a tool to undermine my project. His objections to the turbine were framed around noise concerns, but I quickly realized they were nothing more than a pretext. The turbine operated well within legal noise limits, and independent assessments confirmed that it was virtually silent. Yet, Greg persisted with his campaign, directing multiple complaints at the HOA and trying to rally other residents against me. Each argument he presented seemed calculated to escalate the situation, even though there was no legitimate basis for his claims. The more I investigated Greg's actions, the clearer it became that his opposition to the turbine was not about noise or any other genuine concern. Greg was heavily involved in large-scale energy projects, particularly wind farms, and I suspected his financial interests were tied to these developments. A small, residential wind turbine, like the one I had installed, could undermine the profit potential of these projects. He had the means to influence decisions within the HOA, and it was apparent that he was using that influence to protect his own interests. It wasn't just about my turbine anymore. It was about control. Greg had successfully used his position in the HOA to manipulate situations in his favor. He consistently ignored established guidelines and selectively applied rules to serve his personal agenda. Each complaint he filed against my turbine was more about suppressing my independence than addressing any genuine issues with the turbine itself. In this way, Greg used his role as president of the HOA to push his own financial and personal interests, disregarding fairness or transparency in the process. Despite Greg's efforts, I was determined to fight back. I had invested too much in the turbine, and I wasn't going to let Greg's personal vendetta derail my project. I made it clear to him that I was prepared to take legal action if the HOA attempted to remove the turbine. His response was dismissive. "You'd be wasting your time, Nair," he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Greg's response only confirmed my suspicions. He believed that his position gave him the power to crush any opposition, regardless of the merits of the case. He underestimated my resolve. The more he tried to intimidate me, the more determined I became to uncover the truth. I began researching Greg's involvement in energy projects and discovered that his financial interests in wind farm developments were far more significant than I had initially realized. He was using the HOA to suppress competition, all while maintaining the facade of a concerned community leader. The conflict surrounding the turbine was never just about a piece of technology. It was about power, influence, and the way that Greg had used the HOA to further his own goals. I wasn't just challenging him over a turbine. I was challenging a system of governance that allowed personal gain to dictate decisions. Greg had abused his position to create a culture of control where those who played by his rules were rewarded, and those who didn't were systematically silenced. As the situation escalated, I realized that this battle was larger than just me and Greg. It was about confronting the imbalance of power within the HOA and the broader issue of how community governance could be manipulated for personal gain. Greg had tried to make the fight personal, but it had become something much bigger. The turbine was simply the catalyst for exposing the systemic issues within the HOA, and I was ready to take on that challenge. The legal situation was becoming increasingly dire. The stack of documents on my desk represented the mounting pressure I was under, with each letter from the HOA escalating the stakes. The most recent communication was a final warning, threatening legal action if the turbine wasn't removed. Greg had made it clear that he was willing to use the HOA's power to crush my project. Despite the overwhelming evidence that the turbine complied with noise regulations and all local laws, the HOA's position had hardened. This wasn't just a matter of compliance anymore, it was personal. I had prepared for this moment. Over the past several months, I had studied the legalities surrounding residential wind turbines extensively. The law was clear. As long as a turbine operated within specific noise limits, it was legal to have one in a residential area. Furthermore, I had kept all relevant documentation proving compliance with both local and state regulations. I had even obtained reports from independent auditors, confirming that the turbine's noise levels were far below the acceptable thresholds. However, the law wasn't the primary obstacle anymore. Greg held the power to make this a public issue, one that could ruin my reputation. The HOA was influential in the neighborhood, and Greg's position as president allowed him to frame the issue in a way that could turn the community against me. It wasn't just about whether I had the right to keep the turbine, it was about whether I could maintain my standing in the neighborhood. If Greg succeeded in making this an ongoing controversy, the potential damage to my reputation was real. Greg had already begun using the HOA as a tool to paint me as a troublemaker, someone who was disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood. He had leveraged his connections within the community, and I knew that his influence would only grow if I didn't act decisively. The risk of being ostracized was a real concern, one that weighed heavily on me as I prepared to counter his attacks. Then, a familiar issue arose again, the neighborhood blackout. This wasn't the first time the power had gone out, but it was the first time in a while that the outage had lasted as long as it did. The power had been out for over 2 days, and the impact was far from trivial. Without electricity, I couldn't run my medical equipment, which was essential for my health. The lack of power also made the indoor temperature unbearable, compounding the problem. I had relied on the wind turbine as a backup energy source during these outages, a quiet, reliable system that kept my home functional even when the grid failed. This time, as the power went out again, I realized that this was not just an inconvenience, it was a serious health risk. I could not afford to be without power for extended periods. In that moment, I knew I had to make Greg understand the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just about the turbine anymore. It was about survival. The turbine wasn't just a convenience, was an essential part of my ability to live comfortably and safely in my home. I picked up the phone and called Greg. I needed to make him understand the practical implications of his actions, to show him that what he was doing was not just about enforcing community rules, it was about undermining something that I relied on for my health and well-being. When he answered, I was direct. Greg, I began, you know the wind turbine provides more than just power, right? It's essential for my survival, especially during these blackouts. I know you're going to throw this in my face like the last few times, but think about it. If you're trying to shut me down, you're taking away something I need. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him processing what I had said. Then his voice came through, colder and more distant than before. Fine, he said, his tone calculated. But don't think you're out of the woods yet. He didn't acknowledge the severity of the situation, didn't show any empathy or understanding. Greg's response wasn't an attempt to resolve the issue, it was a reaffirmation of his stance. It confirmed that this wasn't about noise, regulations, or community standards. It was about control. Greg's decision to continue opposing the turbine, despite knowing it was a critical source of power for me, highlighted his disregard for my personal circumstances. I hung up the phone, a mixture of frustration and anger rising in me. Greg wasn't just leveraging his position in the HOA anymore, he was using my health as leverage. His refusal to acknowledge the importance of the turbine to my well-being showed that, to him, the turbine wasn't just a mechanical device. It was a symbol of something he could control, and he was unwilling to let go of that power. This was no longer just a battle over a piece of technology. It had shifted into a battle for control, and Greg had taken it to a new level. It was clear that he wasn't just trying to enforce rules, he was trying to dominate the situation, to make an example of me. The stakes had been raised. The turbine was no longer just a symbol of independence. It had become a battleground for something much larger. In that moment, I knew that I had to fight, not just for the turbine, but for the principle behind it. I had to stand firm against Greg's manipulation and make sure that his actions didn't go unchecked. It was about more than survival. It was about resisting an abuse of power that threatened not just my rights, but the rights of anyone who dared to challenge the system he had built. In the weeks leading up to my confrontation with Greg, I had been focused on the technical aspects of the turbine, its noise level, compliance with local regulations, and the legal rights I had to install it. However, as the situation escalated, it became clear that the conflict wasn't just about a turbine or neighborhood noise complaints. It was personal, and Greg's influence within the HOA wasn't the full extent of his power. There was something larger at play, something I had yet to fully uncover. The idea that Greg might have financial interests in wind farm developments was something I had considered but dismissed at first. It seemed too far-fetched. However, the continued escalation of his opposition to my turbine led me to reconsider. I needed more information. I needed to understand why Greg, a man in a position of power in the HOA, was so relentless in his efforts to shut down my small, residential wind turbine. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that there had to be something behind his actions beyond just a simple desire to enforce HOA rules. The first step was to dig deeper into Greg's background. It wasn't enough to simply challenge his authority. I needed to understand his motivations. I visited the town's records office, a step I had avoided until now. The office housed information about land deals, property records, and any large-scale developments that might be in the works. It was a straightforward move, one that seemed necessary if I was going to find the leverage I needed to counter Greg's relentless opposition. At the records office, I combed through historical documents related to the land surrounding my property. There were several entries detailing land acquisitions and deals involving large corporations. It didn't take long before I found something relevant to Greg's past. Years ago, Greg had been a part of a committee that approved a major land deal. The deal had been made with several large energy companies pushing for wind farm development in the region, massive projects, much larger than my residential turbine. The deal seemed straightforward at first, but as I dug deeper, I found something that made the situation clearer. Greg had played a pivotal role in authorizing the land for these large-scale wind farms. He had been involved in the decision process, helping to facilitate the project's approval while serving as the local HOA president. The timing of his involvement was suspicious. This wasn't just a case of a community leader supporting local renewable energy. This was a case of a community leader positioning himself to benefit financially from a large-scale wind farm project. The wind farm deal was poised to bring in significant investments, and Greg had clearly seen an opportunity to profit from it. What struck me as odd was the stark contrast between Greg's public support for renewable energy projects and his opposition to my small, residential turbine. If Greg were genuinely interested in promoting renewable energy, he would have been supportive of my efforts to generate power locally. However, it became increasingly clear that Greg wasn't concerned with sustainability or energy production at all. His opposition to my turbine wasn't based on noise complaints or community standards. It was based on financial gain. The revelation was shocking but undeniable. Greg's actions had never been about noise complaints or even about maintaining HOA standards. His campaign against my turbine was an effort to protect his financial interests. My small turbine, producing clean, independent energy, was a direct threat to the large-scale wind farm project that Greg had a stake in. While the turbines I had installed were modest and operated within legal parameters, they represented a disruption to the larger wind energy initiatives that Greg was involved in. If residential turbines like mine were allowed to proliferate, they could undermine the profitability of the massive wind farms Greg was pushing. This realization explained everything. Greg's actions, his aggressive stance on enforcing the removal of my turbine, were motivated by a need to maintain control over the local energy market. By shutting down my turbine, he could eliminate a potential source of competition and maintain the status quo, where large energy companies could control power generation without local disruption. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. This wasn't a simple case of noise complaints or even a personal vendetta against MIT. It was about silencing any potential challenges to his financial interests. Greg was using his position in the HOA to manipulate the situation. not out of concern for the community, but to safeguard his own profit margins. This discovery changed everything. It wasn't enough to simply fight back against Greg's claims. The stakes had grown. What I was up against now was not just a local HOA president with a personal bias against my turbine. It was a man with a financial incentive to shut me down. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about confronting a system where power and profit had been allowed to control the narrative, where community leaders could use their positions to secure personal gain at the expense of others. Armed with this new knowledge, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about defending my turbine or proving its compliance with regulations. It was about standing up against a system of corruption. Greg had used the HOA to serve his financial interests, and I wasn't going to let him continue using his position to undermine renewable energy or manipulate the community for personal gain. This was no longer just a dispute over a turbine. It was a battle for fairness and transparency in local governance. I left the records office with a clear sense of direction. The evidence I had uncovered wasn't just ammunition for a legal battle, it was the foundation of a much larger fight. Now I knew exactly what I was up against, and I was ready to confront it head-on. Greg's financial stake in the wind farm project had been exposed, and with this knowledge, I could move forward with a strategy that would hold him accountable. This wasn't just about fighting for my rights, it was about exposing the truth and ensuring that Greg's attempts to manipulate the system for his personal gain would not succeed. The time had come to confront Greg with the evidence I had gathered. I had carefully assembled all the relevant documents and materials, and now it was no longer about defending my turbine. It was about holding Greg accountable for his actions. I knew the confrontation would be critical, not just for my own cause, but for the integrity of the community and the HOA itself. I scheduled a meeting with Greg at the HOA office. There was no longer any need for niceties or formalities. This was no longer a matter of debating the turbine's legality. It was about exposing the truth behind Greg's motivations and actions. I had uncovered enough to make it clear that his behavior was driven by personal financial interests and not any legitimate concern for the neighborhood. When I entered the meeting room, I laid everything out in front of him. The records of the land deal involving the wind farm project, the emails that linked him to key figures in the energy companies, and the detailed timeline of events showing his involvement. There was no room for misinterpretation. His financial stake in the wind farm development was clear. I presented the information in a straightforward manner, providing copies of the documents and outlining the connections between Greg's actions and his financial interests. "Greg," I began, "you're not just fighting me, you're fighting your own conscience. This is about greed. You've been using your position in the HOA to advance your own financial interests, and you've been manipulating the system for years." His reaction was immediate. His face drained of color, and I could see his jaw tighten. He had no response at first, and for a moment, I thought he might try to dismiss the evidence. But instead, he stood up suddenly, his hand slamming down on the desk in frustration. "You don't know what you're talking about," Greg spat, his voice rising. "This isn't about money or any of your accusations. This is about a community issue. It's about keeping things orderly." I didn't flinch. The more he protested, the more his guilt became apparent. His outbursts were a classic deflection, an attempt to shift the narrative away from his personal motivations. But the evidence was irrefutable. Greg had used the HOA to protect his business interests, disregarding his duty to act in the best interest of the community. "No, Greg," I replied calmly, but firmly. "This isn't about the community. This is about you protecting your financial interests at any cost. You've used your position in the HOA as a personal tool to attack me for years, and it ends today." Greg's posture stiffened. He looked like he wanted to argue further, but the weight of the evidence was pressing down on him. He had nowhere to hide. The emails, the documents, the timeline, it all painted a picture of a man willing to abuse his position for financial gain. His stance had always been about maintaining control, about preserving the status quo. But now, it was clear that the status quo was built on deception. For a moment, Greg stood there, visibly struggling to formulate a response. His usual air of confidence had evaporated. He knew that I had the upper hand, and that realization seemed to undermine his ability to argue effectively. His face, which had once exuded authority, now appeared drained and anxious. "This isn't over," he finally muttered, his voice lacking its usual force. "I'll make sure the board knows about this. You can't just come in here with your accusations." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I took a moment to let his words hang in the air. Greg's attempt to threaten me was just another last-ditch effort to regain control of the situation. But he wasn't in control anymore. He had underestimated me, and now I had the facts to back up my claims. "You're wrong, Greg," I said, meeting his eyes with unwavering resolve. You can't hide behind the board or your position anymore. This is about more than just a turbine. It's about how you've used the HOA to further your own agenda. You've abused your position for too long, and it stops now. It's over. Greg's shoulders slumped slightly, the defiance draining from him. He was faced with the reality of his own actions, and there was no way to spin the situation any longer. The evidence was clear, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The financial conflicts of interest, the manipulation of the community rules, and the power dynamics that had allowed Greg to operate unchecked for so long were exposed. It wasn't just about my turbine anymore. The stakes had shifted. This was about exposing a systemic issue within the HOA and holding Greg accountable for his misuse of power. The community could no longer ignore the fact that a leader had been using his position for personal profit, and the damage he had done over the years was undeniable. But with the meeting winding down, I stood up, leaving Greg seated at the table, his face a mixture of frustration and defeat. The fight was far from over, but the battle for control of the HOA had taken a decisive turn. I had laid out the truth, and there was no going back for Greg. The integrity of the HOA was at risk, and with the evidence I had presented, there was now a clear path forward. The next steps were clear. I would take the evidence to the HOA board, and I would make sure that Greg's actions were addressed. This was no longer a fight for a wind turbine, it was a fight for transparency, accountability, and justice. After the meeting with Greg, the HOA board was forced to confront the evidence I had presented. The documentation I provided, which clearly outlined Greg's financial interests in the large-scale wind farm projects and his manipulation of the HOA to protect those interests, could not be ignored. The weight of the evidence, combined with the pressure from the community, left the board with no option but to act. The board convened an emergency meeting, and despite Greg's attempts to control the narrative, the facts were undeniable. The financial ties he had to the wind farm project were laid bare, and his abuse of power to suppress my turbine installation was exposed. The HOA's reputation was at stake, and they had little choice but to distance themselves from Greg's actions. In the end, the board voted to lift the ban on my turbine, a decision that effectively nullified the HOA's previous position. The resolution was a significant victory, but it wasn't without its consequences. Greg's removal from his position as president was inevitable. His influence had been the primary force behind the initial opposition to my turbine, and once his motivations were revealed, it became clear that he could no longer hold the position of authority. His departure was quiet, almost subdued, as he was replaced by someone who promised to restore transparency and integrity to the HOA's operations. However, the fallout from the ordeal was the neighborhood had witnessed the unraveling of what many had believed to be a standard HOA dispute. The reality of the situation, that a community leader had used his position for personal gain, was hard for many to accept. While some residents supported me, understanding the necessity of challenging a system that allowed corruption to flourish, others were more hesitant. They questioned the extent of Greg's involvement, and, to some, the idea that the HOA had been manipulated for years was difficult to digest. The whispers didn't stop after the vote. Some neighbors who had previously been silent now voiced their concerns, either supporting Greg or expressing doubts about the legitimacy of my actions. The narrative that had been pushed by Greg for so long, that my turbine was disruptive, that I was a troublemaker, lingered in the background. Even as the truth emerged, those who had stood by Greg found it difficult to reconcile the version of events they had been told with the new reality. For me, the victory felt hollow at times. The fight had been long, and the personal toll of being attacked for something as simple as trying to create sustainable energy for my home was not easily forgotten. Although I had secured the right to keep my turbine and had seen Greg removed from his position, the damage to my reputation and the lingering division within the community remained. The process of restoring relationships with my neighbors was slow. Many had been influenced by Greg's rhetoric and needed time to adjust to the new reality. For some, the conflict had not been about the turbine but about larger issues of trust and authority. They had trusted Greg, and that trust had been shattered. Rebuilding those relationships would take time, but I remained committed to the idea that transparency and truth were ultimately more important than maintaining the status quo. The legal victory in lifting the ban on my turbine was just one part of the resolution. The deeper, more complex issue was the need for reform within the HOA itself. Greg's actions had exposed flaws in how the HOA operated, revealing the dangers of unchecked power and the potential for abuse. In the wake of his removal, there were calls for increased oversight and for changes to the way decisions were made. The community's trust in the HOA had been damaged, and it would take significant effort to rebuild it. Despite the challenges, the resolution marked the beginning of a new chapter. The HOA was now under pressure to operate more transparently, with greater accountability. The new leadership in place made initial efforts to address the systemic issues that had allowed Greg to maintain his grip on power for so long. Changes were slow and gradual, but they signaled a shift in how the HOA would operate moving forward. As for the turbine, it continued to function as originally intended. It stood as a symbol not just of personal achievement but of resistance against a system that had been manipulated for personal gain. It was no longer just about the energy it generated. It was a statement about fairness and accountability, principles that had been lacking in the HOA before. The victory had come at a cost, but it had also highlighted the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds are stacked against you. The scars of the battle remained, but the resolution had set a precedent for future challenges to the HOA's authority. It had shown the community that transparency and integrity could win out over manipulation and self-interest, even in a system that had long been dominated by those with power. In the end, the battle for my turbine was more than a fight for a renewable energy source. It was a fight for justice and accountability within the community. It had exposed the flaws in the system, and while it was a slow and painful process, the outcome marked a crucial step toward ensuring that such abuses of power would not go unchecked in the future. The community had learned a valuable lesson, and while the road to full resolution was long, there was hope that things would improve moving forward. Months after the resolution of the turbine issue, the neighborhood began to adjust to the changes brought about by Greg's departure and the new HOA leadership. While the immediate legal battle had concluded, there were still remnants of the past conflict lingering in the community. The division caused by Greg's actions hadn't evaporated overnight, and many residents continued to navigate the tension in their own ways. Some had moved past it, accepting the new dynamics, while others remained skeptical or uncertain about the shift in power. During this period, I received an unexpected call from Karen. She had been one of the most vocal opponents of my turbine, often at the forefront of the complaints and protests. Her opposition had been rooted in the idea that the turbine was disruptive, something that threatened the quiet and order she believed the neighborhood should maintain. For months, Karen had been part of the campaign to remove the turbine, raising concerns about noise and the potential harm it could cause to the neighborhood's peaceful atmosphere. However, when Karen called, it wasn't to resume the fight. Instead, she apologized. Her message was brief but significant. "I've been thinking about your turbine, and I'm sorry it wasn't the noise. It was my fear, and well, I don't know what happened." This admission was striking, not because of the words themselves, but because it marked a shift in Karen's perspective. For the first time, she was acknowledging that her opposition wasn't based on facts or a genuine concern about the turbine's operation, but on an emotional response driven by fear. It wasn't about noise. It was about change, something unfamiliar, something that challenged the way she had always viewed the neighborhood. Karen's admission revealed a deeper truth about the conflict. It wasn't just about the turbine itself, or even the energy it produced. The real issue was change. People like Karen, who had lived in the community for years, were accustomed to a certain way of life. The arrival of the turbine represented a shift in that routine, a disruption that was unsettling, even if the turbine itself posed no real threat. I responded to her with understanding, acknowledging the fear that had driven her actions. "I understand," I said. "It's okay." The words weren't just a form of reconciliation. They were a recognition that Karen's opposition had been shaped by something larger than the turbine itself. It had been about fear of the unknown, of embracing something different in a community that had long prided itself on its uniformity. However, Karen's next words added a surprising twist to the conversation. "You know, during the last blackout, when my kids were sleeping soundly in the house, well, I guess I've come to realize we all could have used that power." This statement marked a shift in how Karen viewed the turbine. It wasn't just a matter of personal reconciliation or regret. It was a realization that the turbine, the very thing she had fought against, had a practical and positive role to play in the neighborhood. During the blackout, her family had experienced the vulnerability of being without power, just as I had. What had once been a symbol of disruption now became a symbol of security and self-sufficiency. Karen, single quotes S recognition that the turbine provided something valuable for the community was a moment of clarity, not just for her, but for the neighborhood. As a whole, the very thing that had once been seen as an inconvenience or a threat had proven its worth during a critical moment. It wasn't just about renewable energy, it was about resilience and the ability to provide for oneself in times of need. This was a point that had been overlooked in the earlier debates, where the focus had been solely on the perceived disruption rather than the long-term benefits. Her comment also underscored a broader lesson that had emerged from the conflict. Change is often met with resistance, especially when it challenges long-held beliefs or practices. However, when that change demonstrates its value through experience, perceptions can shift. Karen's shift in perspective wasn't an isolated incident. It reflected a broader trend in the community, where people had begun to recognize the importance of innovation and sustainability, even if they had initially opposed it. In the months following this conversation, the neighborhood began to adapt to the reality of having renewable energy as part of the landscape. The turbine no longer stood as a symbol of division, but as a practical solution to a very real problem. Other residents who had once been skeptical began to see the potential benefits of such a system. It wasn't about being forced into a new way of life. It was about embracing something that could provide security and stability in times of uncertainty. Karen's apology and her newfound understanding were not just about reconciling with me personally. They were about the community coming to terms with the fact that change, while difficult, can bring valuable solutions. It was a reminder that fear often drives opposition, but once people see the tangible benefits of change, they can adapt. The experience had transformed the way the community viewed renewable energy and sustainability. What had started as a battle over a single turbine had evolved into a larger conversation about progress, resilience, and the future. In the end, Karen's shift in perspective symbolized a broader change in the neighborhood, a shift from resistance to acceptance, from fear of disruption to recognition of the need for innovation. It was a reminder that while change may be difficult, it often carries with it the potential for greater strength and unity, especially when it is driven by a desire for practical solutions to real-world problems.